Today we're going to be looking at two thinkers who are both Spanish, who are writing in reaction not only to the First World War, but to the relativism they sense in the air, trying to sort out their own views about realism and idealism, about the nature of human life, about what it is to be human, about, you might say, the foundation for value, about trying, well, really about truth, ultimately. They're thinking through those Enlightenment theses we talked about the importance of truth, of objectivity, of the possibility of knowledge, and they're trying to come up with, and I think succeed in coming up with, unique and original takes on that. These are thinkers who are very important in the history of Spanish philosophy, but often get ignored in English-speaking countries and aren't read much by English-speaking philosophers. I think that's a terrible mistake because I think they're very interesting and important figures. In any case, let's start with Miguel de Unamuno. He was rector at the University of Salamanca in Spain from 1900 to 1924, and then again from 1930 to 1936. Notice there was a 6-year gap in there. He was disliked by the junta that came to power, and the dictator fired him, sent him into exile, in fact, into the Canary Islands. He managed to escape and spent the rest of his time in France until that government was deposed and he was able to come back to Spain. He was immediately rehired at the University of Salamanca, and he came back and began his lecture simply by saying, as we were saying yesterday, that was not his original thought. The same thing happened to Fray Luis Ponce de Leon, who lived in the 16th century. He was investigated for some years by the Inquisition, was prohibited from teaching. When he was finally reinstated, having been found innocent, he began his lecture that way. So this was not only clever, but also a sort of historical allusion. It also illustrates something important about Unamuno's life. He had reason to be bitter. He was fired, he was sent, in effect, into prison in exile, and his reaction to all that was not to come back and tell his story of woe, but simply to say, as we were saying yesterday, and picked up where he left off. That was a kind of attitude about life that he exhibited in many different respects. Here is a statue dedicated to Ponce de Leon in Salamanca, and here is an image of Unamuno, who inspired an entire generation of Spanish intellectuals. His works were significant at the time. They were noticed internationally. This is, for example, a page of the New York Tribune in 1922. Notice that is Unamuno holding up a statue of Quixote, and this is a review of one of Unamuno's books. So throughout the 20s, he was a figure who was important not only in Spain, but really throughout much of the world. And here is a page from the book that we're going to be talking about, The Tragic Sense of Life. And one of his great hobbies was origami. So that is a little bird that he made himself out of a page of his book. So his bird is reading his book. Well, anyway, I don't really get that, but I think it's cool. In any case, this is something of a motto for the book. I am a man. No other man do I deem a stranger. He's interested in what we have in common. And in fact, later, we're going to look at an American author, Saul Bellow, who has many themes in common with Unamuno. He's getting this from an ancient author, Terence. And so we should look at the original. This is what Terence famously said, Homo sum, humani nihil ame alienum puto. I'm a human being. I consider nothing human alien to me. Okay, so the idea is that I'm a human being. I have humanity in common with every other human being. Nothing human, no one human, is really a foreigner to me, is a stranger, is alien to me. Here's the context in Terence. A character called Menedemus says, why do you care so much about things that don't concern you? Basically, he's yelling at this character Cremes for gossiping, really, for paying attention to all sorts of other people. It's like, yeah, why do you care about any of this? And the answer is, I am a human being. I consider nothing human alien to me. I consider it either to warn me or to provide an example. Now, I confess, it's not that I disagree with the sentiment. I love the sentiment. And yet, I'm not at all like this character Cremes. I go into the supermarket, and there are all these things near the checkout counter, right? All these magazines and stuff that have images. Ooh, so-and-so is pregnant, or this person is, I never know who these people are. So I say to my daughter, who are these people? And she says, well, I think that person starred in some series that only lasted one season on some cable network 5 years ago. Well, nobody knows who that is. Why do they make magazines with people who nobody knows who any of these people are? Well, she sort of laughs at me because my idea of, come on, where are John Rawls and Saul Kripke and other famous philosophers on these things? I'd buy those magazines. Oh, Saul Kripke does this. And, well, yeah, but I don't know who any of those people are. So anyway, I'm not at all like Premise, but he is somebody who is sort of a gossip. For his time, he was doing the equivalent of reading those publications, watching The X Factor, and doing crap like that. And his colleagues say, why are you doing this? What a waste of time. And this is his answer. Now, for Unamuno, it has some real philosophical significance. He says, the man of flesh and bone, the man who is born, suffers and dies, above all who dies, the man who eats and drinks and plays and sleeps and thinks and wills, the man who is seen and heard, the brother, the real brother. Now, what is he doing in this passage? Notice it's not actually a sentence. He's just talking about humanity. And he's talking about what it is to be a human being. Now notice, we've looked in the past at some alternative explanations of what it is to be human. What is it to be human? What makes us special? How do we differ from other animals? We've talked a little bit about this, but we need to return to it. Sentience, somebody says. Well, are animals sentient? Yeah. I mean, animals, I think, cats are rarely sentient, but they do sometimes wake up and pay attention to what's around them. So we ordinarily think, look, other animals are sentient, they're conscious, they actually sense the world and are aware of what's happening. What else?
Our sense of progress.
Our sense of progress. Well, we do have a sense of progress, of developing our activities over time. And I don't know to what extent animals have that sense of progress. You're probably right that they don't. At least I never get the sense that cats, for example, accomplish anything. Now, maybe cats are unusual here. Bees accomplish something. They actually build hives. Ants build colonies and so on. So some animals seem to accomplish something, but admittedly, a lot of them don't. Yeah?
We plan and we have egos.
Good, we plan. Now, what do you mean we have egos?
We have a sense of self that feels entitled.
Animals also have egos?
Ooh, well, yeah, we have a sense of self. Let's take just that part. A lot of philosophers have thought that's very important. It's not just, in other words, that I'm aware of the world. I'm aware of myself. The typical philosophical term for this is self-consciousness. So that would be one way of understanding what it is to be human, to be self-conscious. Not in that sort of middle school adolescent way of everybody's looking at me, but in the sense of, look, I can think about myself. I'm aware of myself as an independent being, as well as the things around me. But now notice you also said feel entitled. You might say, there's a sense in which that could be a character flaw, but in another sense, maybe that is what we think of as being human. I feel as if being a human being, I have a certain dignity, and that entitles me to a certain amount of respect. If somebody comes in and suddenly punches me and stabs me, it's not just I think that's bad. I think somehow my rights have been violated, or a wrong has been done. And so we think about things in normative terms and think of somebody injuring us as really not just harming us, but actually violating us, right? As doing something wrong as well as doing something that's bad for us. What else could we say is distinctive about humanity? Yeah.
We spend time thinking about why things work.
Good, we think why, right? We think how. And it's not clear that other animals really do that. Have you ever seen a raccoon take an apple and just think, why is it here? What is it to be an apple anyway? No. And so that ability to reflect, to think about the larger picture, to ask why, to ask how, is connected with that thought about planning with self-consciousness, and so seems part of what is distinctive about humanity. What else is distinctive? Yeah?
We have a sense of morality.
Good, we have a sense of morality. And so we do think in terms of things being right and wrong. Other animals don't generally seem to do that. A lion chasing an antelope. Does it ever stop and think, what'd that antelope ever do to me? No, presumably. And so there are things that we think about, right and wrong, justice and injustice, that other animals don't seem to think about. Other things. Yeah?
We do things that are not necessarily necessary to survival, like creating art and music.
Good, we do things that aren't necessary to survival. We can not only appreciate beauty, it may be that animals can appreciate beauty, but we create beauty, we create art, we create music. We pay attention to our surroundings, right? People don't just move into a place and just kind of inhabit it the way animals do? Do animals decorate their dens? You know, does a raccoon sort of take this little place and think, that wall's just kind of dull, I need something colored there? No, I mean, there are no raccoon interior decorators. Elephants presumably do not sort of think, what do I want on the walls here? And so there are a lot of things that seem distinctive of us. Now, if we think about what is really at the core of all this, we've seen some examples of answers to what is essential to humanity. What is it really to be human? And Unamuno's worried about people's tendency to have too simple an answer to that question. He says, there is another thing which is also called man. And he is the subject of not a few lucubrations, more or less scientific. So what are these lucubrations, these ruminations, these thoughts that people have, these theories? Well, he then surveys some definitions of humanity. Plato. He is the legendary featherless biped. This is how Plato defined a human being. A human being is a featherless biped. We stand on 2 feet and we don't have feathers. Reportedly, another ancient Greek philosopher plucked a chicken and threw it over the walls of the academy to refute him. Featherless biped, human being. That seems like a particularly crummy definition of humanity. I mean, it may be true that we're the only featherless bipeds, but somehow that doesn't seem to get at the core of being human. Intriguingly, Xunzi, a 3rd century BC Chinese philosopher, also considers this definition and mocks it. But I think it's one of the things in ancient philosophy that makes me think, was there more communication than we think? Did that just occur to him? Or did he somehow hear about Plato? In any case, well, that's neither here nor there. Aristotle, he talks about the zoon politikon, that is, the political animal. The animal who does act according to rational plans, who engages in rational activity. So that's a possible definition. Then there's Rousseau, the social contractor. What is essential to me? I am somebody who participates in the social contract. I am capable of forming an agreement with others to set up a certain kind of society. Okay, that's the core of who I am for Rousseau, and actually not much else is, because Rousseau thinks everything else is malleable. Everything else about me is plastic, is changeable. In economics, you could say I'm a rational utility maximizer, okay? The Homo economicus, he refers to it, the Manchester school. Here, I'm not sure, that was just an influential school of economists at the time. It's really this economic conception that what do? I consider my options, I rationally maximize my own welfare. Or in biology, Homo sapiens of Linnaeus, so you might think of me in strictly biological terms as being of a certain species biologically. Or, he says, just the vertical mammal. That could be a common sense definition. There's a little image of evolution. Notice it leads up to John Lennon on the Abbey Road album cover. And then we devolve. Well, anyway, Unamuno doesn't like any of these. Notice if we go back to his characterization, actually, we see it's more complicated than that. Who are we? Well, we are people of flesh and bone. Okay? We are born, we suffer, we die, we eat, we drink, we play, we sleep, we think, we will. We are seen, we are heard. We are brothers, i.e., we actually have something in common with other human beings and we recognize that common humanity. Now, a lot of those things don't really fit this sort of conception of what makes us separate from the animals. Other animals are born, they suffer, they die. They drink and eat. They may play and sleep. They think and will. They are seen and heard. And so, really, you might say, he's missing the point. None of these really get at the core of what it is to be human. But in a certain sense, I think his point is, look, there is no such thing as the core of being human. We are beings who do all these things. And if you just look at us as rational utility maximizers, or as biological entities who are trying to pass our genes on, or as featherless bipeds, or as people who engage in rational plans, you're missing something. We are beings who are in a certain setting. We aren't just accidentally physical beings, for example. We aren't just accidentally beings who are born and die, who think and will, who drink and play, and so on. So all of that is important. So he's suspicious of anybody who treats mankind in the abstract. He says, man, neither of here nor there, neither of this age nor of another, who has neither sex nor country, who is in brief merely an idea. That is to say, a no man. That is what all these other theories do, he thinks. objects. They all reduce us to one dimension. But if you want to think of it this way, we're many-dimensional creatures. We don't just have one single dimension. We aren't just rational utility maximizers. We aren't just featherless bipeds. We aren't just rational planners. We aren't just biological beings. We're somehow all of these things and much more besides at once. So you have to look at us in the concrete, not in the abstract. Now, part of that concreteness is to recognize the importance of emotion. He's not only suspicious of people who take a complex subject matter like humanity and try to reduce it to one thing, though that is one of his major enemies. He also wants to say, look, people have too great a tendency to think in terms of reason alone, or of something related to reason, acting according to rational plans, or a certain kind of reflection or whatever, as distinctive of humanity. But he says, look, that's understandable, and that's in a way what philosophy tries to do. Philosophy answers to our need of forming a complete and unitary conception of the world and of life. Think back to Sellers and the idea of trying to put everything together into one picture. But he says, as a result of that, a feeling that gives birth to an inward attitude and even outward action. So it's natural to think of us as people have a certain view of the world, and then they react to it in a certain way, and they have certain emotions. But he says that's not really the way it is. The fact is, this feeling, instead of being a consequence of this conception, is the cause of it. Our philosophy, our mode of understanding or not understanding the world and life, springs from our feeling toward life itself. So his point is really that we don't start thinking about things in a certain way and then decide how to feel about them. We feel a certain way about things, and as a result of that, we think about them in a certain way. So what's really fundamental in philosophy, or just, this is sort of philosophy in the small p sense, not in the philosophy department of type sense, but just in the, what's your philosophy of life?
How you feel about it?
How you feel about life, exactly. You know, in fact, he would love that. How you feel about it, right? That's the core of it. And then how you think about things depends on how you feel about it. Are you basically an optimist or a pessimist? In the end, he's going to say, that doesn't come down to a theory about life. It comes down to a feeling, an attitude you have about life. That's what's really at the core of it. Are you attracted by realism or by idealism? He says, is that really determined by some philosophical argument? It's a question of how you feel about the world. Do you feel as if the world is somehow something you construct and create? Or do you feel as if the world is really something out there, independently of you? In the end, that's a feeling question more than a thinking question, he thinks. So, in a way, here's an important implication of that. Philosophy in the English-speaking world tends to focus on arguments, counterexamples, things like that. Unamuno's point is really, that's kind of all beside the point. Nobody decides what they think on the basis of a counterexample or of somebody's clever argument. You're more likely, if you feel another way about it, to just think, I don't know what's wrong with that argument, but there's got to be something wrong with that argument. And so in the end, he says, look, philosophy doesn't need to focus on argument all the time. It should really focus on a certain view of the world and showing you what it is to see the world that way and how it is expressed, you might say, in a feeling. So, what are we really? Well, for Aristotle, we've said, yeah, we are rational creatures. We engage in rational activity. For Descartes, we start with the I think. I think, I am. So what am I? I am a thinking thing. I am essentially a thing that thinks. And Kant later affirms that. Yes, that's what it is to be a human being, a thing that thinks. So thinking is really elevated by not only these three philosophers, but most of the philosophical tradition as what is really essential to humanity. But he says, man is said to be a reasoning animal. I don't know why he hasn't been defined as an affective or feeling animal. Perhaps that which differentiates him from other animals is feeling rather than reason. More often have I seen a cat reason than laugh or weep. Here's a cat reasoning. How am I going to get down from this tree? How am I going to get off this roof? That cat loves to do that. She races out the door, climbs up this tree, gets on the roof, and then just stands there and it's like, oh crap, how do I get down from this roof? Daddy, meow! Here is Emmett, and I don't know what he's seeing, but clearly engaging in reasoning. But do cats smile? This is actually a brother and a sister cat who were separated when they were very young for months and were reunited. And they're clearly smiling, it seems to me. But that's not exactly laughing or weeping, but at least I can show you a cat smiling. Anyway, Unamuno's point is that feeling is just as essential to us as thinking. And, he says, in a philosopher, therefore, what must needs most concern us is the man. In other words, he is saying, yeah, think about the arguments, think about the positions, think about the theories and their adequacies and inadequacies, but also think about the person behind them. Now, most philosophers would say, look, that's just some elementary kind of fallacy. You can't attack the philosophy by attacking the person. This would be an ad hominem, an argument to the man, to the person. In other words, instead of the theory. But he says, actually, it's not a fallacy. You want to know what it is to hold a certain philosophical position? Look at the person who holds it. How do they live? Are they admirable or are they not admirable? Take a look at what it's like to actually live this philosophy in practice. So, there's an entire book devoted to that thesis, really. It's Paul Johnson's book, Intellectuals. Johnson is a historian. And what he does is go through the life of many prominent intellectuals over the past several centuries. Rousseau, for example, he describes him as an interesting madman. Karl Marx, howling gigantic curses. Henrik Ibsen, on the contrary. Tolstoy, God's elder brother. Bertolt Brecht, A Heart of Ice, etc. Well, anyway, Unamuno's point is, if you actually think about the lives of famous philosophers, it's sort of disturbing. I was walking with one of you to class last week, and whoever it was said, you know, I think some of these philosophers are insane. Okay, they're crazy people. They're actually psychotic. Interestingly enough, a psychotherapist who got injured and during his recovery sat in on my ethical theories class said the same thing to me. He basically said, I can diagnose all these people. Everybody we've read from this course is psychotic. That person's a schizophrenic. That person's a manic depressive. And so on and so forth. And sometimes it feels that way. If you look at these people's lives, sometimes it's pretty disturbing. Socrates, for example. Philosophers admire Socrates for asking questions, for probing people to really understand what they're saying. And yet, you see him in Platonic dialogues occasionally seducing young boys. Okay, it's like, hey, want to hear about philosophy, little kid? Like, you know, today it's like, hey, you want to ride? Then it was kind of like, hey, you want to hear an argument? Rousseau, what about Rousseau? He basically married when he was young this rich heiress so that he never actually had to do anything to live. And they had 5 children together. When each was born, Rousseau just took them to the local orphanage and dropped them off and never had anything to do with them again. What about Nietzsche? He ended up dying in an insane asylum. Bertrand Russell, he basically betrayed everyone he ever knew. Heidegger became an ardent Nazi. We'll consider that later. He was one of Hitler's great boosters within the universities. Jean-Paul Sartre, it turned out he lived with his mother. His mother did his laundry through his entire life. Well, there are various ways in which you might look at these people and you think, yeah, do you want to be like them? So Unamuno's point is, don't just look at the philosophy. We judge a philosophy in part, now admittedly just in part, by judging the lives to which they lead. Now, of course, it's possible that Sartre doesn't actually put existentialism into practice, but it's also possible he does, and that's the life that this philosophy produces. So Unamuno's point is, yeah, look at the person. Look at the person behind this and say, is that a good way to live? If that theory goes with that life, think about them together. The theory can be judged independently of the life, but in some ways, he says, that's misleading. Look at the life in combination with the theory. Now, is he right about this? For example, suppose you find out that some famous scientist in the past had some terrible character defects. Does it affect your judgment of the science? I mean, probably not, right? Suppose you find out that a surgeon who's going to operate on you actually has serious character defects. Suppose you find out, for example, that he is wanted for, I don't know, let's say, fraud. Not medical fraud, he really is a surgeon, but you know, he's been passing bad checks and he's set up some shell companies that have collapsed and the IRS is after him and so on. Does that affect your judgment about whether or not to have the surgery with that doctor?
Yeah, as long as he does good surgery.
Okay, so it's interesting. Some of you are saying no, as long as he's a good surgeon, why should I care? Others are saying, yeah, right? It suggests to me, look, if you're willing to cut ethical corners there, are you willing to cut ethical corners elsewhere? So anyway, it's not clear to me exactly how we ought to come down here. But Unamuno's point is, look, I'm just saying it's relevant. It's not the only way to judge it, but it's relevant. Hegel made famous his aphorism that all the rational is real and the real rational. But there are many of us who, unconvinced by Hegel, continue to believe that the real, the really real, I have to punch something when you say the really real, is the irrational, that reason builds upon irrationalities. Now, what kinds of irrationalities? In what sense could you say that our lives are based on things that are irrational? It doesn't feel irrational most of the time, right? But go ahead.
Do you mean irrational or seemingly random?
Well, there's a lot of randomness too, and we'll get to that with Ortega. But here I think he really means that there are certain contradictions built into our attitudes themselves. And there's a big one, really. He says contradiction, of course. We only live in and by contradictions. Now why? Life is tragedy. The tragedy is perpetual struggle, without victory or the hope of victory. Life is contradiction. In other words, we struggle to survive. But, guess what? We are all mortal beings. We all die. So in the end, we all lose. It's kind of like playing a game, okay? And in the end, you will lose the game. So why not give up now? Why struggle to live if, in fact, you're bound to die? That's the kind of contradiction he's focusing on, because he's saying, look, suppose I offer you this deal. I say, hey, listen, we'll play a game. It's a card game, and by definition, I win. Okay, you can either make it over quickly, or we can make it go on for a long time, or, if you like, you can't play at all. But, hey, no matter what you do, you will lose. Why play the game? Why try to make it go on as long as possible? And yet we do that, right? As living beings, we strive to live. We strive to survive. We strive to thrive, even though in the end we know our life is fated for tragedy. And so he says we're aware of that. We're aware that we can't really win in that game, but we try to keep the game going as long as we can. And so he sees some kind of contradiction in that. Now, I think a lot of people would say, that's not a contradiction, that's not irrational. Life is something of immense positive value. That's why we cling to it, even though we know we can't cling to it forever. But he sees it as, well, as something of a contradiction. In something like the following way, maybe. I know of people who are retired and pursuing a second career, or actually come back to the university and trying to learn new things, even though they're retired. You might say, what a waste of time. You know, you're done. You're not going to do anything with this. But of course, the person there doesn't think that's a waste of time. They think they're still learning. They're still gaining something. If you look at it from one point of view, you could say, but look, you're preparing yourself for a future you won't have. From another point of view, however, you could say, no, that makes sense. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And so he's worried that at a certain level, if we really try to explain why we're doing what we're doing, we won't be able to do it. It depends more on values of the heart than on anything else. The values we're discussing, he says, values of the heart. Against values of the heart, reasons don't avail. For reasons are only reasons, that is to say, they aren't even truths. So in the end, do we have to have reasons for the things we do? His answer is no. There are certain things we do just because the heart tells us to do them. And what reason is there? We don't really have a reason. Are there things that are like that you do, but you couldn't explain to anybody why you do it? If somebody stops you and says, man, why are you doing that? The only answer you could give is something, well, I want to do it, right? You couldn't explain it. Yeah.
I think it's fear. Like
Fear.
you can't. If you feel like you say like, well, what's the point of living? You might say like, well, I'm afraid of dying because I don't know what's. It's fear of the unknown. You don't know what's gonna happen.
Ah, okay, right. Yes, so the struggle for life, you could say, is motivated in part by fear of what the alternative is. There are probably other things, though, that we do where we can't give very good reasons. What are some things you do just for the hell of it?
Superstitions.
Superstitions? Ah, yes, like that commercial that they show on NFL games, where the one guy's rubbing the other guy's head. It's weird only if it doesn't work. There could be things like that, where if somebody says why, it's like, it's just the thing I do, right? I mean, I don't have an explanation, it's just like it's worked out so pretty well so far. Yeah.
Career choice. Or
Say it again?
choice of career.
Choice in career, good. A lot of times, can you really give reasons for that? Why did I end up studying philosophy? Somebody says, give me your reasons. That's hard to explain. In the end, it just had this appeal for me. I liked it, right? And the same thing is true, let's say, for music. Why do we actually create and listen to music? It's hard to give reasons for that. I mean, there might be reasons. You might say, oh, I read this book, The Mozart Effect, and so I read Mozart all the time before an exam. Read Mozart. I listen to Mozart before an exam. Because I think, right, but that's not why most people listen to music. It's just somehow, I don't know, it's based on a value of the heart. It's not based on a value of the mind, really. And so, his worry is that if we just isolate ourselves from that feeling, from the values of the heart, we're going to be making some mistakes. And in particular, he says there's an important ethical and political implication. It's not unique to him. It is really a take on Kant's categorical imperative. Kant said, treat humanity always as an end in itself, never as a means only. Always treat people with respect. Do not use them. And Unamuno makes that a little bit clearer than Kant. He says, look, that means treat each individual person as an end in him or herself. Each one of us has a certain dignity as a human being. And part of what my obligation as a human is to recognize the humanity in other people and respect it. And so I am to treat not just that abstract thing, humanity, but the humanity in each and every person as an end in itself. So that means I treat everybody with respect. So leaders, he says, leaders have to remember that they're ordering about people, okay? Men of flesh and bone, men who are born suffering, although they don't want to die, die. Men who are ends in themselves, not merely means. Men who must be themselves and not others. Men, in fine, who seek that which we call happiness. And so you've got to treat other people with respect. People cannot be sacrificed for the good of the next generation or for some abstract ideal or for utopia. They have to be given respect.